Hey guys, it's Kai, and in my last previous video in the meta-analysis, one of the final really interesting lines and comments that I briefly discussed about was Hacker Camille. Now, as you may know, Hacker Camille isn't that great, but it turns out that when you look into the statistics, that for Hacker Camille, when you play it with Riftwalker, is surprisingly kind of strong. The stats are actually supporting the idea that 3-star Camille could actually work. At the time of making the meta-analysis video, I had only just looked into the stats and I never played the comp myself. But after about a day and a half of me experimenting with the comp, playing it on and off stream, I think I have a general understanding as to how the comp works, and I want to discuss about why I think it's actually a pretty interesting and strong line. So without further ado, let's just talk a little bit about the comp and talk a little bit about how to play the comp, why it's strong, what are its weaknesses and stuff like that. So first off, let's just get this out of the way. How strong is the comp? Now, in my opinion, it is not S tier. Definitely not an S tier board, but it is definitely higher than A tier. So I would say it's like an A plus tier board. So it's definitely a line that you should know, but keep in mind it's A plus for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons why it's A plus is because one, it's not very easily forceable. It is admin dependent, meaning that if you don't get a really early admin, like HP scaling, for example, or anything like scaling AD over time, every 5 seconds, your team, or admins rather, gain 18% AD. If you don't get either of those, it's probably not a Camille game. On top of that, the board requires a lot of finesse. You get very hard punished if you do not hacker the correct side. So scouting is really important, and if you forget to scout, it can be detrimental. Even though it actually beats a lot of the current S tier meta boards, such as, let's say, Nico TF, Infinity, jhin Soul, a lot of these front to back comps, it's a huge counter. It actually does incredibly well against these boards, but surprisingly enough, it actually does poorly against sort of the lesser meta boards. Stuff like Hacker LeBlanc, any Gadgeteen actually, it's a 50-50. Gadgeteen is S tier, but if you kill the Sona, great, but if you don't kill the Gadgeteen Sona, you're kind of fucked. In terms of Laser Core Warwick, a capped out Laser Core Warwick board will beat the Camille board. Things like Mordekaiser 2, 6 Laser Core, that will actually completely outcap a Camille board. You won't be able to win against that. Finally, of course, any Bill Gates board, so any like Urgot 2, Fiddle 2, whatever the fuck, like you just have an infinite money, infinite legendaries, that's you're not gonna beat it. That's just not how this works. But again, it beats a lot of the current meta boards, stuff like Lulu Reroll, jhin Soul, whatever that I said earlier. It beats all of those because it's, again, really great. It's a hacker board that completely counters the front to back meta that we currently have. But now let's also talk about when would you actually ever play Hacker Camille, because you might be thinking to yourself, hey, like if I'm playing Renegades and an AD line, why don't I just play Jhin? That's a very common question that comes up, and quite honestly, it's a great question. Why wouldn't you play Jhin? Because Jhin is more consistent, requires less finesse, can be an S tier board if you have ASOL 2, Jhin 2, and a bunch of other things as well. Why not just play Jhin? Right? That's a valid question. My answer to that is, hey, listen, sometimes your tempo is leaning one way more than another. For example, the Camille board is, again, really strong in a lot of front to back lobbies. Let's say like 3 people are playing Jhin, or like 3 people are playing Spellslinger's Oxforce. You can just play Camille, and you're gonna have a much easier time top 4ing in that lobby compared to playing Jhin. Also, in general, just if you have like a lot of Camille's in the early game, and you happen to be able to hold the vast majority of them, or you happen to notice that like, hey, like I have a lot of them, and hero augments are coming up 3-2, maybe I can play Camille instead. You know, it's another approach to an AD line that already exists within the Renegades line. Again, this board requires a lot of finesse, so let's talk about the game plan and how to actually play the board, as well as the board itself, the board direction, and just even miscellaneous things to keep in mind when playing this board, because there's a lot of niche tidbits of information we should probably keep in mind. But without further ado, let's go and look at the board. So here, as we can see, this is the Hacker Camille board. This is sort of the end goal, if you will. This is the end goal. It's a level 7 board, actually. You actually usually end the game at level 7, sometimes at level 8 if you're lucky, but most of the time you're ending at around level 7. I mean, to be honest, you do end up level 8 most of the time. But in terms of the board itself, as you can see, it actually relies on Pyke 3, Camille 3. It's actually a dual carry board relying on these two. There are other ways to play this board as well. You can also play around a potential LeBlanc 3-star as well as your secondary carry instead. That's totally fine if you happen to find a lot of LeBlancs. But in general, Pyke 3-star, Camille 3-star, this is the most consistent. Now, how does the early game look? How do we approach the mid game and whatever? Well, during the early game, you would probably have something like this. 3 Renegade board. It's basically, if this looks any bit familiar to you, this is actually the exact same starting lineup that you would have if you're kind of trying to play into Lucian reroll back during the previous patch or 2 patches ago. I don't remember. You'd have a Renegade line early game, and you'd also have like the Camille early. You could also just be strong boarding in general, so you don't even have to have the Renegades in here. It could also be looking something like, I don't know, something like you have Renekton 2-starred here, and you have Camille, and then maybe just like a Morgana or something like that just happens to be your strongest board. That's fine as well. This is a perfectly strong board throughout the early game that could potentially lean into an early Camille or Camille Hacker reroll. Now, the game plan itself, as you may have guessed, it is a roll on level 6 board, but before you actually hit level 6, you might notice something here. 1. Jhin. You need Jhin at level 6, which sounds nuts. The fact that this board relies on having to find a Jhin at level 6 might make you go, I'm just going to play Jhin instead. If I find an early Jhin, why not just lean Jhin? Again, this is an alternative line that exists if you happen to have a lot of Camille's or a lot of 2-star Camille's early, or maybe you even hit the Camille Hero Augment. This line actually might be doing better for you. And again, you're not always going to get this Jhin in the early game. In fact, most of the time, you're not going to get it in the early game. And you won't hit it at level 6, and that's totally fine, and that's totally normal. In fact, what you should be doing instead is that before you hit that Jhin, what you can do, and what I've personally found to be pretty nice, is you just play Morgana until you find the Jhin. So what does this mean? It means you can do static shift Morgana, so you can just like shiv and just reduce the armor and MR across the whole board. Totally fine as well, and I actually kind of prefer this too at level 7. What do I mean by this? Well, the idea is that Camille, once you 3-star Camille, you 3-star your Pyke, you want to push level 7, and obviously you're going to want to have your Jhin here, but what ends up happening is that Morgana is actually a really nice unit to tech in at level 7, where she just acts as a threat, and she just sunders the whole board. Obviously, though, you also have this gap here with 2 out of 3 Renegades, and you can actually play into a, like, any Renegade, it doesn't really matter, but any Renegade unit here, and I don't know if this is stronger. I'm going to be completely honest. I don't know if this is stronger than just having to shiv Morgana on your board, but it probably is. Just tech into Renegades at level 7 as well. That's totally fine too, but again, you can play the Morgana until you hit the Camille 3, the Pyke 3. You might also notice another thing too. We're playing 4 Hacker. We're not playing 3 Hacker. The stats on Camille 3 Hacker are, quite honestly, pretty abysmal, and, you know, we can actually look into it real quick. Let's look into it in real time. Let's go to Masters Plus here, and we look into Camille. And we look into Camille with 3 stars, and then we look at 3 Hacker. 3 Hacker is sort of the original idea of Camille Hacker and where this originally came from. And as we can see, averages of 4.15. Actually, surprisingly not even that bad, right? But if we look at 4 Hacker here, we'll notice it actually averages a 3.79. It's actually significantly better. Not only is it significantly better, you might also notice that if we change the delta here, we might notice that, hey, the delta is actually really, really low. Really low. Negative 1.04 when we have units like Jhin on our board, units like Pyke on our board, units like Vex on our board. When we're playing Rift Walker in this line, instead of just a 3 Hacker like before and maybe like a 3 admin, or sorry, a 3 Hacker and a 4 admin board like the previous approach used to be. We can even compare this here when we look into something like, let's say, for example, this is the Camille line. This would be with Rift Walkers, right? Versus before when you would play something like 3 Hacker and then 4 admin. Averages of 4.15. Not that great. So again, this sort of development of using Rift Walkers to tech into 4 Hacker instead of 3 is really, really big. For those of you who don't remember, when Hacker was sort of the dominant thing in the meta, like about 2 or 3 patches ago, and Gnar Hacker was it was a terrible problem, really. I don't know if you remember that shit. That shit was terrible. But during that time, the Hacker, 3 Hacker, right, used to be what 4 Hacker is today. So 3 Hacker back then was 20% Omnivamp for Hackers, 15% for the Rider. So when you think of it this way, this is like saying, hey, I'm basically playing the old Hacker, but I get to play it on this patch instead with just Camille 3. And surprisingly, really, really, really strong. Now, again, this board, it will not win you lobbies. It will not win you lobbies. It will not win you games. Well, it won't win you most lobbies, but you'll be able to top 4 pretty consistently if you happen to find the line and you aren't really forcing yourself into it, but rather you had a good opening for it and you want to lean into it. Very, very great, consistent top 4 comp. I will say this though. When you're playing this comp, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One of the things to keep in mind is that your Pyke and your Camille need to be on opposite sides. Okay? So always make sure that this is the case. The reason why is because your Camille is going to go and hack into the backline. Let's say in this example, it goes onto the right side of the opponent's board. Your Pyke is going to crisscross applesauce, go across the board, and basically stun whatever Camille is working on. Really, really important. Really, really, make sure that you position that correctly. Another thing, too, is that your Camille items are a bit constrained. You don't have too many options. And what I mean by that is that you really want GA. GA is sort of the big ticket item here, and quite honestly, if you're not playing the Morgana, Last Whisper is actually really, really nice to have. Not necessary, because again, you're going into the backline, but at a certain point, it gets to the point where Camille kills everything in the backline and then has to now 1v9 the rest of the board. And, you know, against really high armor opponents, you're going to have a terrible time. So Last Whisper actually here is really nice because not because she's trying to clean the backline with Last Whisper. I mean, it's nice to have and it gives crit. But again, it's so that once she kills all the backline units and all the carries, then when she's trying to kill the tanks, she's not having too much of a difficult time. But, you know, this is sort of the reason why she's not very good against Warwick, because Warwick actually does better in a 1v1 against Camille, even against a 3-star Camille. But, you know, again, that's assuming you have like 5 or 6 laser core, you know what I mean? But again, Last Whisper is really great. GA is mandatory. I don't care what you say, GA is mandatory. And then IE, this could be anything. This is sort of your flex option here. This could be something like Deathblade. It could be Titans. A lot of great stuff. I think IE personally works best here, especially if you have a scaling AD admin. But again, I digress. This third item is a bit of a flex, but GA mandatory, Last Whisper highly recommended, and then third item again flex. Another really important thing to note is that this is not a board that you can just lose streak early game with. Like you lose streak stage 2 and then try to pivot into stage 3. If you are going to lose streak stage 2, do not play Hacker Camille. Here's why. When you play this board and you play it into Hacker Camille, and let's say you do a whole 3-2 transition, right? You do a 3-2 transition. Let's say you even hit the Jhin at level 6. What ends up happening is that you have 2-star, 2-star, 2-star. Well, I mean, I doubt this is a 2-star level 6, but 2-star, 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 right? Even if you manage to hit all of this at level 6, this board will probably still lose. Camille 2 is a great unit stage 2. Not that great during stage 3. It's okay during stage 3. So if you lose streak all of stage 2 and your plan is, hey, I'm going to just roll down on 3-2 and try to hit all my units and try to just win streak from there, you're going to have a terrible time. This board, especially the time in between trying to hit Camille 3 from Camille 2 and Pyke 3 from Pyke 2, you're going to start losing. Stage 3, you should expect to lose during stage 3, which is awkward and different compared to other 2-cost reroll comps such as Winds of the Wanderer, or even stuff like, I don't know, freaking Winds of the Wanderer is the first one that came to mind, alright? But the point is, usually on 2-cost reroll comps, usually you're win streaking throughout stage 3. This is the opposite. You're actually probably going to start losing starting stage 3. So what I like to do when I'm playing this comp is actually, if I'm strongboarding early, slowly pivot and transition into Hacker Camille. What do I mean by this? Don't pivot into Hacker Camille if it's not your strongest board. That's the main general rule of thumb. It sounds obvious when we talk about it, but sometimes what a lot of, especially lower elo players, what they'll do is that they'll think, oh, I'm playing Hacker Camille this game, so as soon as I find a Shen 1, I'm just going to take it onto my board. Don't do that. Don't do that unless it's your strongest board. You should always be constantly playing your strongest board, and just hold the units that you're eventually going to take onto your board on your bench, and then wait until you upgrade them, and then toss them in, because that will then be your strongest board. So, for example, let's say that during the early game, you have something like this. This is like your early game board, and you're thinking, hey, maybe it's possible I play like a Hacker Camille line. Let's say this is your level 4 board, going to level 5. Turns out you have something like, oh, I don't know, something like Lucian, and then you have like a Silas 2 or whatever. And like, you know, you could have like Silas starts with an S. Silas 2. Let's say you have like Silas 2. Let's say you have maybe like Protected 1, Silas 2, like a Lucian, and like a Kaisa. You know what I mean? Like, if this is your strongest board, and this is like your level 6 board, and let's say like this is also upgraded here. Let's say this is upgraded too, right? This is your strongest board. Don't just immediately tech out of it just to play Hacker into your board. That makes no sense, right? Instead, what you should be doing is that you find a Vex, hold on to it. Just chill, wait it out, you know? Don't take it onto your board unless it's your strongest board. It makes no sense, right? Maybe you find like, I don't know, you find the Jhin and you find the Vex. Cool. Don't immediately pivot. If you immediately pivot, you're gonna lose stage 3 anyways. Keep that in mind. Again, 3 Hacker, because you're not gonna hit that Jhin early. It's gonna be really hard, and it's very niche when you find it at level 6. When you do, perfectly fine. But again, don't pivot immediately. Wait until your board is stronger with your pivot, and then pivot. And I think that's a lot of the big problem with a lot of people who they sort of tunnel vision with these 2-cost rerolls, is that once they think they have to pivot, they just immediately do it, and then their board is weaker. Don't pivot into a weaker board. That never makes sense, right? But anyways, that's basically the gist. And again, one last thing to note, Camille 3, Pyke 3. Let's say you hit Camille 3, you don't hit Pyke 3, just push level. Push level, and you can actually play Jhin 2 as your secondary carry, so you're actually playing a full AD board. Or you can even take into something like Threats or something like an Aurelian Soul. You have a lot of options at your disposal. Again, the ideal board is something like this at level 7 with the Leona. And then if you want, just play around, you know, Jhin 2. This is like your secondary carry instead. Or maybe even a Soul. That's fine as well. Something like this, totally fine. Totally fine, totally viable. If you hit that Camille 3 super early and you're like, let's say like 5 pikes away from pike 3, fuck pike 3. Just push your levels. Push your levels and just play from there. If you really want to, you could maybe even try taking down to 3 hacker at a certain point and then taking into 5 renegade instead. I don't recommend this because I do think the jump from 3 hacker to 4 hacker is literally insane. So if you can, definitely 4 hacker. And then I would just flex something here. Morgana, Ace Soul, Fiddlesticks, it don't matter. Just flex something here for your level 8. And even your level... If you managed to hit level 9 playing this board, I don't know what you did. Fucking leave a comment. Let me know. But regardless, flex your level 8. And if you go level 9 for whatever fucking reason, eventually, you know, tech out a Camille, play some sort of 2-star legendaries. You get the idea. That's basically the board. If you have any other questions, please leave them in the comments. If you have, you know, something you want to mention, something you want to discuss about this board and about this line that you've noticed. But in general, again, I think this board is really, really slept on. It's really, really, really strong. And feel free to try it. If you ever find yourself in a position to play Hacker Camille, do it. It's actually a really fun line. It changes things up, so you're not playing Jhin Ace Soul or Nico TF every single game. It's really, really nice. So I highly recommend it. But anyways, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys learned something, and happy climbing.